Hello everyone, Panzer J back with a new video. This video is going to be on Historical Board Gaming Global War 1936, and this is the version 3 map that has just recently come out, and it looks beautiful. The pieces, the game is set up as well, but the setup is for 1939 start. So obviously, if you're starting at 36, the setup is going to be different than what I have here right now. But we'll go over the map a little bit and the pieces and how everything looks. Kind of take a look at the colors. They really pop. Scanning over the map here. Very vibrant colors. I think the map looks really nice. Just the look of it itself. And then they've done some cool things. They've added in some terrain, which there was terrain on the version 2 map as well, but they've got even more terrain features added in, just to add even more authenticity to it. Like down here in Brazil, we've got like a rainforest going on. A lot of mountain terrain in Spain. You can see the mountains. Yugoslavia, same thing. Turkey, down into Iran. And we got some jungle effect going on in Southeast Asia. A little bit of jungle terrain there. Same thing with down on some of the money islands like Sumatra and Borneo and all those. And then you got some more tundra up in northern Russia, across the top of northern Russia there. So that looks really cool. Also, some things different that I noticed is it seems like they've, both in the Atlantic here and over in the Pacific, they've gone ahead and extended or added some sea zones, which I think is really cool, and it definitely adds some more realism. Like I know before, the U.S. could make it over to France in three moves. So basically one turn, because they would be starting at a port in the United States, so they could go 1, 2, 3 and land in France. And then over in the Pacific, same thing with Japan. They could, starting at one of their ports in Japan, make it to Hawaii in 3 moves, which would be 1 turn. And now it looks like they've added one extra stretch of sea zones. So now, for instance, Japan's starting here, and Hawaii's over here. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So you can't make it to Hawaii in just 1 turn now, which is, I think, is better for the game. I think it was kind of unrealistic that, either the Japanese going to Hawaii or the United States coming over here to Europe could make it in just 1 turn. I definitely preferred to see, a force kind of sitting in the ocean, taking at least the 2 turns now to make it over. And same thing if you're starting over here off of New York. 1, 2, 3, you're going to be just short. 1, 2, 3 up here. Going from Washington, 1, 2, 3, you can make it over here to Portugal or Spain. But as far as France itself, you're not going to be able to get over to France from the continental United States, which I definitely think, again, is more realistic and more representative of the kind of time frame it would require to move, a bunch of transports and ships and whatnot from the United States over to Europe, or again, if you're going from Japan to Hawaii. So I think that's very cool. I like that they've done that. Again, this is set up to 1939, so kind of looking over the map in terms of units and stuff. Again, Definitely some things are different from version 2. The United States starts out with a big-time naval presence over here in the Atlantic. There's a couple of battleships, a couple of cruisers, a fully loaded fleet carrier, a bunch of destroyers. If memory serves, for version 2, there's not nearly as many U.S. ships in the Atlantic. So that is definitely a change. And then the U.S. on the Pacific side, I think that's about what the size of the fleet that version 2 had. You've got a couple of light carriers, a fleet carrier, a couple battleships, a bunch of destroyers and some subs. So just overall, the U.S. has definitely got a very strong Navy to start version 3 if you're starting in 1939. And potentially, the U.S. could go ahead and bring this Navy all the way over the Pacific to combine the two fleets, or they could just leave it here in anticipation of getting into the war and really put a hurt on Germany without even really having to buy much, just from the Navy they currently got there. Also, the British got their usual strong naval presence. This is a little different. We got a battleship off of Gibraltar. I don't believe that was there for version 2. It's definitely not there in version 1 of the game, the 1939 game. And then up top, the usual, although we've got 2 light British carriers instead of 1 fleet carrier, which is usually the case. And then we've got some destroyers and some cruisers down around Scotland and South England. Going back to what's going on in terms of naval units, the French got a couple of nice fleets, one off of Normandy and one off of southern France. Italy's got their usual fleet sitting around Taranto. And then something different that I don't believe, again, I've seen in previous games. We got a couple Italian ships down in the Suez. A cruiser and a destroyer, so that's different. That's kind of cool. And then Britain again has the usual naval presence off of Cairo, light carrier, a battleship, destroyer, transport, and cruiser. The Germans don't have as much going on as far as subs. We've only got 2 subs in the Atlantic right now to start the game, although they do have a couple of subs in the place units box that they'd be able to put down right away. But as far as in the Atlantic itself, just those 2 German subs. And then we've got a German presence up outside of East Prussia. We got a battleship. I believe that's a heavy cruiser. Destroyer, transport. So a few German naval units, but Germany doesn't look to be as strong, at least in terms of a U-boat presence, to start this 39 scenario. And then over in the Pacific, Japan's looking strong. They've got their usual fleet in Japanese home waters. We got a couple of fleet carriers, a light carrier, a couple of battleships, some heavy and light cruisers, a bunch of transports, and then a bunch of Japanese units spread out down going into the South Pacific. Got a big mess of all kinds of different ships here, a bunch of different nations represented. You got the Far East Command, you got France, you got Japan, all right outside of French Indochina there. But again, Japan definitely does have a bunch of ships, but I'm not quite sure they're as strong in relation to what the Allies can put on the board as compared to other versions of the game. Again, you've got a big U.S. fleet over here with those 3 carriers, so they're matching Japan carrier for carrier in the Pacific to start. Japan does have a little bit of advantage, so they got 2 fleet carriers and 1 light, whereas the U.S. has 1 fleet and 2 light, but still 3 carriers to 3 carriers. The battleships, again, the U.S. has got 2, and Japan's got 2. So Japan definitely has a little bit more, but when you combine that with what the French got going on, the Dutch, and the Far East Command, it looks to really be just about even. Japan really doesn't have a naval superiority going on. Now, granted, the United States obviously isn't in the game to start, and they have very low income, just like in other versions of the game. But as far as like units actually on the board, I don't think Japan really has too much of an advantage in terms of naval units to start. If we're looking at some of the ground units, again, I think the Axis are not quite as strong. I mean, Germany does have a bunch of stuff, obviously. Bunch of infantry and some tanks, some light and medium tanks they start out with, and a decent air force. But again, if you're thinking back to version 1 of the game, 1939, definitely Germany isn't, they don't have nearly as many units on the board, especially when it comes to the air force. There was a bunch of, I think in the version 1, there's maybe like about a half a dozen fighters and Stukas each, just not nearly as much. Germany shouldn't have any trouble with Poland here. The Poles shouldn't be able to put up much of a resistance with what Germany's got. But then over here in Western Europe, I'm not so sure. The French got quite a bit. And again, since Germany's not starting out with as much, I'm not sure how easy it's going to be to, as the Germans, to take care of the Poles and then come over and deal with France. It'll be interesting when we can actually get into and play a game, see how it plays out. So Germany, again, I don't think is quite as strong to start this game. The Russians got the usual, a bunch of stuff spread out throughout the board. They do have a bunch of factories. And in version 3, besides major and minors, you also have medium factories. So they've got a bunch of factories on the board, which again, I think is more representative of what how World War II actually was. Russia had the capacity to produce a ridiculous amount of tanks and planes and artillery pieces. So I like that they've added a bunch of territories that have at least, like in Smolensk, in Kiev, there's minor factories. There's major factories in Orel, Kursk, in Leningrad, in Moscow, and then the medium factory in Stalingrad. I think that's a nice improvement there. I like that for the Russians. Let's see what else. The Italians don't have a lot going on. They just have the one major factory, so that's different from version 2, I believe, and definitely from version 1. They just got the one factory. Down in the Middle East, Tobruk is now an actual territory by itself. Although I think the Italians do have a little bit of an advantage here in North Africa. They have a stack of men, a mech, a tactical, and an artillery. And the British don't have a lot, so depending on if the Italian player wanted to get aggressive and go right at the beginning of the game, he could possibly be putting some pressure on the British big time, at least in North Africa to start off. The British don't have a lot as far as like ground units going on. A few men and some mechs spread out in England. A couple of mechs up in northern England. And then they do have a decent air force. They got a medium bomber. Maybe I think that's 2 medium bombers there. 3 fighters and a strategic bomber. So pretty good British Air Force going on. And then over in the Pacific, as far as ground units go, again, things are a little bit different, starting in 39 here. So we got Japan already has a minor factory on the Asian mainland. So that's kind of cool. Usually typical move for the Japanese player in the other versions of the game are to start buying minor factories almost right away so they can start placing units directly in Asia. So that's cool that they start out with that minor factory. But if you take a look between the communist and the national Chinese, quite a bit going on there. So Japan starts off on the mainland with a bunch of infantry, cavalry, some artillery. But it looks like Japan's going to kind of have their hands full right from the start, trying to take on the Chinese. They do have some stuff up here in northern Manchuria on the border with Russia, but not so sure that you would, as a Japanese player, want to go after Russia that quickly. So Japan definitely has got their work cut out for them in China. Down here around Vietnam, French Indochina, we got some French units, just an infantry and a militia. You do have a couple of ships there, though. And then the Far East Command's got their usual, some infantry and some militia spread out. A minor factory in Calcutta, so all that's, fairly typical. Malaya has got the fortress, coastal artillery. The Money Islands don't have a lot going on. Mostly militia, one infantry from the Dutch, and then a couple ships. That's another difference from at least version 1. I know the Dutch had quite a few ships down in the Money Islands, I believe, like a cruiser, a coastal battleship. So at least a couple other, maybe another destroyer or two. So they had a few other ships, so not as much of a Dutch naval presence in the Pacific as earlier versions of the game. And then the Australians, the usual couple of ships, destroyer, cruiser, transport, and then a few infantry units, and that's basically about it. I don't see any planes on the board for Australia to start the game. So definitely some differences, not only with the map, obviously, and again, it looks beautiful. Definitely the best version yet as far as the map goes. And I definitely like how they've added sea zones, making it a little bit more of a journey to get to where you want to go if you're coming from North America or trying to get to North America. So that's definitely cool. And like I said, as far as just overall impressions, without actually having played yet, I think the Axis are a little bit weaker to start. Germany, definitely the Air Force isn't nearly as numerous as it was. And even in ground units, I think they're basically on par with France, really. I don't really think the Germans have a numerical superiority, which they didn't when they invaded France. So I guess that's more representative of how things went. And then the Japanese in the Pacific, like I said, definitely a strong naval presence like they should have, but with what the combined Allied units on the board, I think it's actually about even. Not really too much of an advantage for the Japanese. And then if you, again, take into consideration what the U.S. has over here, I mean, that's a substantial U.S. naval presence. I mean, you've got all together, looks like 4 destroyers, 3 transports, a coastal sub, a regular sub, 2 cruisers, 2 battleships, a fleet carrier with a tactical and a fighter on there. So the U.S. right from the jump, not that they're actually in the conflict, but they can move that Navy around as long as it stays in adjacent sea zones to U.S. territory. They could move that fleet around. I mean, they could take that out, bring it over to the Pacific. You combine it with what they already got over there, and that's more than a match, really, for what Japan has to start. And then for the place units box, we got a bunch of ships in various stages of development here. So this is kind of equal across the board. I mean, the Germans got, I believe that's a fast battleship. The Italians got a battleship. The Japanese got a fleet carrier and a battleship going. And then stage 2 here, we got a French, I believe that's a light carrier couple of British cruisers, a light German aircraft carrier, which that's cool. They didn't actually complete an aircraft carrier during the war, so that's kind of neat. And then for the place units box, we got a bunch of ships from a bunch of different nations. Here's the 2 German subs I was talking about that can be placed on the board right at their turn, along with a German destroyer and some Allied ships, Japanese sub and light cruiser, I believe that is. So that's how things look for the start of the 39 scenario here in version 336. As far as the pieces, pretty much got everything. There's a bunch of new units to version 3. There's seaplanes, there's tank destroyers, and a couple other units that are escaping me at the moment. And not all nations do they have sculpts for everything, so you got to kind of get creative. I like having things color-coded and as representative as that nation as possible. So what we've got going on is a few things don't currently match. Like I'm using yellow to represent kind of the Axis minor powers. They're not called that yet. They're neutral and haven't been aligned. But that would represent Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland up north, and then the Spanish, Franco, and obviously we're starting in 39, so Franco has won the Spanish Civil War. So all those are represented by the yellow chips, the yellow pieces, but there's a few units that currently aren't in yellow, like the minor factories. There's no yellow factories. There's also no yellow cavalry or yellow militia. So got to use white for those for now, but I think I'm going to try to actually paint those. So those will all be color coded to the Axis minors. And then the orange we're using to represent kind of the Allied minor powers. Again, they're not aligned with the Allies, but they fought with the Allies in the war. So you've got Greece down here, Yugoslavia, Poland, and the Netherlands, all in orange. White down here in South America, up into Central America, Finland, and Norway, Norway and Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, a bunch of units down here in Africa, and then spread out through the Middle East. They're all white because they were strict neutral. I mean, some of them were leaned one way or the other, either pro-Axis or pro-Allied. But unless, one of the sides actually goes in there and activates them, they're going to stay neutral. So those are all represented by the white units. And then as far as units that are missing, I don't have seaplanes yet. They're coming. I'm going to have to get a little creative with that because, again, there's not, each country doesn't have their own seaplane. So maybe have to do a little bit of painting there as well. Medium bombers are another thing that isn't represented by every single country yet. So use a combination of maybe some Axis and Allies pieces. Maybe use some generic HBG pieces and then just paint them or whatever to that specific country. Let's see what else. Tank destroyers are pretty much represented in the game. Almost every nation, at least the major nations, all have. The Germans, I know, they have pieces for like the Yad Panther, the Elephant Tank Destroyer for Stugs. The U.S., I believe, has Hellcat. The USSR has Su-76s. The British, I don't think, have a specific tank destroyer, but they basically used U.S. equipment when it came to that for the most part anyways, at least mechanized anti-tank. So I'm going to use Hellcats just in the British tan color for those. Let's see. What else? They also have a bunch of new naval units. Besides just having classic cruisers, they have light and heavy cruisers. They have, I believe, battle cruisers, and they have heavy battleships, fast battleships. So a bunch of different naval units have been added. Not really sure what I'm going to do with some of those pieces. I mean, some of the countries do have, like I know the Japanese and the United States have both light and heavy cruiser sculpts already. So that's easy there. For the British, they actually don't even have a cruiser sculpt. I'm using the Axis and Allies sculpts for their cruisers. And what I think I might do is use Historical Board Gaming's neutral cruiser sculpt that they got, and just get that in the British tan, and use one for the heavy and one for the light, and kind of do that as best I can with the cruisers. The battleships, that's going to be an issue. Most countries only have just a single battleship sculpt. The US, the Japanese, and the Germans actually have several. So we'll have to get creative with those. And then for battle cruisers, I'm not sure what to use for that sculpt. I was thinking about possibly getting some Axis and Allies 1914 cruiser pieces and using those for these World War II battle cruisers for each of the nations, but we'll see. Got to try to get your hands on those, which that game is like hard to get a hold of, and the pieces for it as well. So, but we'll see. But for the most part, I would say things are set up as far as not only the initial setup, but as the pieces is about 95% right now. The order I currently got on the way will just about finish that off. But hopefully some additional sculpts will be coming down the road for these new units that are in version 3. But that's how things look for version 3. Can't wait to get into this. Definitely going to have a lot of fun. It's definitely a step up from the version 139 game that I usually play. But hopefully get some guys over here, get into this, and have a little bit of fun with it. So take care, and we'll see you next time.